All right, so we're gonna start. I know we're a couple of minutes behind. I think that's been happening for the last couple of panels, so I just wanted to say a couple of things differently than I did at the beginning of the last panel, which is I'm really excited that we have the opportunity to talk about what's happening with a third of the students in this country in terms of Latinx students. I see one of the things that we really want to make sure happens over time, and it's certainly a goal is to have the conversation we're having here be in so many of the rooms around this summit. I do not want this to be what it has often been, which is a lot of friends and family and brown people in the audience. So it is an incredibly important conversation, and not one that can possibly be done in the kind of time that we have. And so what we're going to do is just to talk about some of the ways in which we have engaged effectively with Latinx students and some of the kind of interventions that would be helpful in not only scaling those effective programs, but also really being able to think about what are some of the gaps and one of the focus areas that we want to have people address from multiple different perspectives at this convening. So I don't need to tell anyone here the Latinx population of students in this country is the fastest growing population of students. And we expect that it's already at 25%, if not a third of students around the country. And in every state, in every city, in practically every locale. And so and so this is not something that is easily segmented, and we should not be doing that. And also just to think about from a teacher perspective, about 8% of teachers in public schools are Latinx teachers. And so many, we know that about 20,000 teachers, and I'm going to bring in something that we might talk about in a number of different ways, which is how this all interacts with what's happening in terms of a number of other kinds of policies outside of education, like immigration. But 20,000 teachers are either eligible for DACA or DACA, currently in DACA. And so when you think about who and how we actually make sure we're effectively serving Latinx students, these are the kinds of things that we have to think about in ways that we might not otherwise usually think about. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patricia, who's going to start us out, and we'll go from there.
Okay, great, thank you. If you know anything about Latino students, I'm sorry, I'm still tripping over Latinx.
Do it, yes.
Okay. You probably know that there's huge gaps between their performance, their academic performance, and all other students. And in just about every way that we can think of, they're not meeting the standard. So let me just begin by saying one thing about these students. That other researchers, as well as myself, have concluded that Latino students, particularly those of Mexican origin, which are 2/3 of all of the Latino students, are the most successful students in our schools. These are our most successful learners. And the reason I can say that is because they make the biggest leap from one generation, the parent generation, to their generation of any group in our society. The average parental education for Latino students is somewhere in middle school. These kids are overwhelmingly graduating high school and going on beyond that. This is enormous. We've asked a tremendous amount of them, and they have delivered. In 2000, 62% of Latino students were graduating high school. Today, it's about 83%. That kind of growth in high school graduation has never been seen before. These kids are stepping up to the plate. So I think we need to just start with the notion that there's nothing wrong with the kids, but there is something wrong with the way we're going about educating them and the way we think about the communities that they come from. So while I have that good news for you, I also have some very bad news for you, and that is that while we've made these huge gains in high school graduation, we are lagging so far behind in college completion that it runs the risk of really undermining the economies of the largest states in this country. 60% of Asian American students get at least a bachelor's degree. About 42% of white students get at least a bachelor's degree. For Latinos, nationally it's 18%. In California and in Texas, it's less than 15%. We can't fill the jobs that are out there, and we can't move this group into the middle class unless we do something radical, like we have done with high school graduation, to get these students successfully through college. So why do we have this big problem? We have this big problem because of poverty, because these kids are overwhelmingly living in poverty, because of segregation, because they are clustered in the lowest performing schools in this country, and they are clustered together with other kids who don't have much information about opportunity in this society, and they're not getting it. And it is important to mention at this point in time that half of these kids come from homes in which there is an immigrant parent. And immigrants right now are being terrorized in this country, and it is completely upsetting the schools that these kids attend and the communities in which they live. It is very hard for a child to concentrate on learning when that kid doesn't know if his parents are going to be there when he gets home in the afternoon. So there are many good programs. They're all underfunded. We know that things like wraparound services are critical in these communities, but they're rarely found. And so I'll turn it over now to my panelists, other panelists, to talk about some of the things they've been doing that will actually address this.
Thank you. And thank you for starting off with talking about all the great things that the kids in our communities have. I really appreciate that. Building off of that, since 1980, the college completion rate for Latinos doubled, right? And Latinos start businesses at a rate that is 3 times faster than the national average. My sister is an entrepreneur as well, and luckily I was able to graduate from college too. So I connect personally to all of this data. There are over 56 million Latinos in this country, and I think what Dr. Gándara points to around the gross underinvestment, to me really means that there is a wealth of experience and knowledge and creative capital that is just vastly underleveraged. And so that means that we're leaving talent on the table. And I think that, there in the Latino community, the belief in the American dream is still very much there. And we're just not tapping into that. And so when I think about how we really have to just turn that over on its head, is we need to focus on 3 things. We need to focus on practices, policies, and people. And these are the things that we need to do to invest in Latino communities. In terms of practices, the panel before, they shared with us all the things that we know that work, right? So 1, we learned about the kinds of programs that work for the vast majority of Latinos who are English language learners, right? We also know that having more diverse teachers is good for not just Latino students and Black students, for all students. So we really need to diversify the teaching pool. We also need to ensure that we are bringing leaders to lead schools that are going to create environments that are much more culturally inclusive and are much more likely to create environments that make our students safe, particularly now, where there is this element of terror happening in our schools. In terms of policies, our policies need to be much more intersectional in their approach. We can't just say we're going to focus on what's going to happen in the classroom and going to ignore everything else that is affecting whether a student in that class can meet their full potential. So that means that we know we need to invest in things like SNAP, right? We know that there is a correlation between families who are on SNAP. They have higher graduation rates than families who are not on SNAP. We know that we have to invest in things like Pell Grants, because for kids who are living in poverty, they make a real difference as to whether or not they will complete college. And we also need to ensure that our states are investing in higher education, because our kids need supports to get through higher ed once they actually get there. And we need to do things like policies. We need immigration reform in this country, because that is, until a child and a family feel safe, how can they truly engage in that school? How can they demand anything of that school? How can kids really meet their full potential if they're living in fear that when they go home, their parents might not be there? And I think the third thing that we need to do is we need to invest in people. And that means that we need to invest in diverse talent. If you look at your teams and you don't see Latinos, you are really missing on access to a whole community, right? You're missing on the ideas, the innovations, the experience that are going to make your organization much more successful. So I focus on practices, policies, and people.
So I live here in California, and actually I don't think it's any accident that 4 of your 5 folks up here are Californians. I think the data that you started with, which is that a third of K-12 students are Latino, is representative of the national conversation, but in California, it's 52%. And in Los Angeles, just the small hamlet to the north of where we are here in San Diego, it is 73% of students. And so there's a way in which, there's a saying in LA about California being the future, which I think a lot of times people sort of say in a self-referential way. And then there's also, I think, an element to it, which is, it is the future only sooner in LA. Yeah. And so there's ways in which I think the experience of a couple of geographies across the country presage what is coming to a theater near you. My work focuses primarily on early learning, and so it focused at this idea of what, if we know there are opportunity gaps, if we know there are achievement gaps, that there are disparities in graduation that are highly predictable, that are highly correlated to race, to zip code, to economic status, what do we do to get ahead of that problem rather than to be complacent and wait for the problem to basically just weigh down on children and families? What that actually looks like, again, in the context of LA, is the first year that you have standardized test scores in 3rd grade. What we know, and that these are 2 different populations, and I think it's important to distinguish, among English language learners in 3rd grade, there's 7% of 3rd graders who are actually reaching standards, which is an astonishing, breathtaking 8-ball to climb from behind. The numbers are better for Latino students overall, but still show incredible space for growth, with 36% of LAUSD 3rd graders hitting English language arts proficiency. What we also know is that, to your point earlier, there are programs that work, that are not particularly rocket science or mystical or unknown in our space. What's also really obvious is there's a program called EduCare, which is actually based originally out of Chicago, but is now a national model. Some of their best progress on Latino students, but also on dual language learners, is in EduCare of Miami. And what they show is when you have 2 years of early learning for Latino students and for dual language learners, both, it effectively erases the achievement gap. And so their control study of kids who are now in 5th grade show academic performance not on par with their local elementary school, but on par with middle class kids, which is a pretty phenomenal growth trajectory. With that in mind, however, what we know also is that as California has browned as a state and become a minority-majority state, we've seen historic disinvestment and lower levels of K-12 funding in ways that are suspiciously predictable. I think part of the conversation around what California's systems need is the same conversation of what Latino kids need, because the future of California's educational system is going to be overwhelmingly Latino. And so we need to think about investing in ways that are targeted and universal. In the early learning space, there's a conversation called targeted universalism, which sounds sort of like a misnomer, but we know where our disparities are, we know what the strategies are that actually work, but what we have failed to do is muster the political will to pay for those interventions that work. The last thing I'll just add on the immigration conversation is the Monday after President Trump's Muslim ban, and this speaks to sort of our web of intersectionality across races. The Muslim ban wasn't about the Latino community, but the vitriol was so high and so over the top that what we saw in our publicly funded preschools the Monday after the Muslim ban weekend happened was 3/4 of early ed centers reported off the charts absences, where parents of American-born children who are legally entitled to everything that the public schools offer kept their kids home. And that is a climate of fear that is hard to overcome with just public messaging. Right. That even in the Great Blue Wall that California describes itself, or behind the Great Blue Wall, is not something that allowed children to go to school. And that is grossly unnecessary, shocking, shameful, and we need a strategy to get through that.
And I think, just building off on that point, the work that we do is with families and parents, and echoing absolutely this issue around what Latino or Latinx students need. I think it challenges us to think about them in the context of a two-generation, three-generation context, which is very different, I think. I think many people may relate to, every generation gets better, and, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's sort of the common wisdom that was handed down between one generation to the next. And I think among Latino students and this particular issue, the mentality is you leave no man behind. You leave no one behind. And so I think that that's a fundamentally different way of approaching the work that we do in education and beyond. And so we see the importance of including the parents and not disempowering the parents, because parents often will be the reason why, despite the context of fear, they will show up and take their children to what they think needs to happen. But I will absolutely echo what Kim said. The work that we've been doing in LA and across the state in the last 2 years, we have data to show that, and we work with about 17,000 parents a year here in California, that we have to invest almost 50% more resources to get half the parents to show up. This isn't, this comes as no surprise to anybody, but at the same time, it's precisely because we have the information that we can't kind of hold ourselves back to ignorance, right? We know this is happening, and we know what it means to overcome it, right? Whoever's providing social services, whoever's working with families in this context, need additional resources. We need to come to the families in a very different way. And I think we need to acknowledge that this isn't healthy, right? And I think the first, when parents do show up, and I often have said this, to our parent engagement, because they know this is so important to their kids. And so they're willing to walk down the street, even if they're afraid of what might happen. But they tell us, is it okay if I don't sign in, right? Which of course we say, absolutely. So we take pictures, right? Why? Because our funders still require us to meet 50 parents, right? You have to show us. And if we're not showing you that you have 50 parents at a family engagement graduation, then you're not doing your work. We have 70 parents showing up, 25 of whom are willing to sign the work. And so I think the challenge for us is, so then do you stop the work? Our answer is, of course not. We just need to have a conversation about this matters for Latino families, this matters for Latino students. We don't have the privilege of ignoring the fact that these families have legitimate fear, but more importantly, we don't have the privilege of saying we are going to write off 57% of the population in the state. We don't, and I think that's our challenge here, is to think holistically about Latino students as part of a family, and really think about the family as an asset, and how we work with parents in a three generation approach and construct, because that is really the way that we bring a whole family, we bring a whole community to the next level.
Anurima, I would just add one thing here about the early childhood is so cool. It's like, where are you going to put your resources, right? Because at every point it's critical. But we just completed a national survey of the impact of immigration enforcement on the nation's schools. And what we got back from that, from thousands of educators across the country, I was amazed at how frequently this came up over and over and over, that in the high schools, the educators were telling us, my best students, the ones who were primed for scholarships, the ones who were going to four-year universities, are quitting because they don't see what the future is going to look like for them, and they can't rationalize applying themselves to school when their families are going hungry because the father lost the job because of raid, or because somebody in the family, and it isn't always just the parents, the grandmother, the older brother who came to, somebody in these families is at risk, and the whole family is at risk, and the kid takes it on himself or herself and says, I've got to help out. I can't go to college. And this breaks my heart when I look at the statistics that we have about Latinos go to college at the same rate as white kids do. They just don't finish it. They just get themselves into debt, working to go to school, and then getting debt, and then they have to drop out.
And a lot of our conversations are often focused on the admissions process or along those lines, and it's taking up a lot of the air in the room about what we need to actually support students to be able to stay in school and in the higher education context. You know, I was thinking, I mean, there's so many things that the conversation has already sparked. I think one of the remembrances I'm having is thinking about a place like Tucson, which Patricia knows I spent a lot of time in on a long time desegregation case at a time where Arizona was really coming down hard on its immigrant populations a number of years ago, and there were programs in Tucson that were extraordinary at engaging the Latino population in Tucson that were targeted, right? And not only did we see, and those programs were then dismantled, right? And so not only did we see, the message that we got was very similar to what you were getting through your study, which is that not only do they find the teachers, the program that they had felt most comfortable in was now gone, right? The comfortability piece, the feeling that they were in a place that valued them, that was safe, that they can actually be excited about, that was gone, right? And that, more importantly, it was intentionally gone, that someone had actually come after it. The ways in which that actually reverberated in terms of not only the students who were engaged in those classes, but across the board for even younger students. And that's where we see the proliferation of things like the school to prison pipeline, the ways in which students become disengaged, and we find, frankly, so many of our monetary resources going to things like having kids be in juvenile detention or wherever else. I mean, I think about the $100,000 a year that it is costing to have a student right now in an immigration detention center, $100,000, and they're not getting health care, they're not getting proper food, they're not getting an education. And so how do we actually think about systemically where we squeeze at one end, where we're really creating sort of like, in any way you want to measure it, a problem on the other. And so I want to go back to one of the things that we all talked about, which is what are the sort of some of the positive program strategies that we can talk about that are able to engage students. And one thing I would just want to start with is for all of the different, again, back to the platforms to engage students. How fun would it be, maybe, all right, to think about how to really design platforms that might be able to engage students and make them feel safe and comfortable in an environment that we're in right now of such fear, right? So what do we do right now, and how do we think about how to create safety or feeling of safety? And that can be anything from, you don't actually have to come and sign in, right? We have other ways in which we're trying to create a space for you, and it may be a space that is anonymous in other different ways. How do we actually have parents feel like they can engage in different ways that are accessible to them? And I get that certainly, computers and websites and internet are not accessible to so many parents in ways that we don't actually often realize. And how do we actually do some of that differently? But that's just one big way in which we could be thinking about this, given the sort of fear that we know is prevalent right now. I know there are many others, so I just want to turn it over to all of you to think about that. And before I do that, if there are questions, there are places to write them and pens around the room. I would love to have, if folks have a question, just raise your hand. We'll have someone come and pick up a question and bring it up here.
I'll just say really briefly, and then I'll turn it over. We asked that question of the educators across the country. What is it that you need in order to be able to do this job? And I'll tell you, Anurima, they want lawyers.
Yeah.
Right.
They want lawyers in the schools because the teachers don't know what to say to the parents. The administrators don't know what to say to the teachers. The students have all kinds of questions. They don't know to whom they can address those questions. We need actually legal help in the schools.
Yep. Well, to build off of that, so EdLock is a community of leaders of color, and we work to elevate the voice and the leadership and the influence of people of color in education. Primarily, we are Black and Latino, and part of the reason why that is because we also want to build a tighter Black and Latino coalition. And in terms of what the kinds of things that work, I'll give you an example of one of our regional networks. We have a regional network in New Orleans that is predominantly African American, but we have a growing Latino population there because after Katrina, we had an influx of Latinos helping to rebuild New Orleans. And we have a leader there who was trying to implement sanctuary policies in one of the local school districts there. And this is one of the things that really sent signals to communities around what a school system was willing to do. And when school systems stood up and said, we are implementing sanctuary policies, and these are what the policies are going to do to help support teachers and principals if ICE were to show up to your school. So when systems started implementing, it sent a signal to communities, right? So our leader in New Orleans wanted to take some of those policies that we had sent to all of our leaders, but she was having a really hard time getting any traction because the leadership there would say, well, we don't have a Latino problem because, most of our kids are Black, which, she organizes Latino parents. She's like, well, actually, that's not true. So she wasn't getting any traction. She brought together our regional network, which is made up again of Latino and Black leaders. And one of the Black leaders, who is the general counsel, lawyers, of one of the charter management organizations, said, what about if we recraft this policy so that it's much more inclusive? And not only does it speak about not allowing ICE to come into schools without warrants, without permission of parents, without talking to the superintendent, but we say any law enforcement needs to ask for permission of parents and needs to ensure that they have a warrant, because the same type of systems or lack of policies that allow ICE to come into schools and question students allow other law enforcement to come in and question Black students. And all of those things are contributing to the school to prison pipeline. And so together, they crafted a more inclusive policy, took that to the local school board, which passed. And so I think that this is an example of the kinds of policies and the kinds of approaches that we need to take so that we can actually create environments that are much safer for our students beyond just Latino students.
And for the parents. That's wonderful.
Yes.
That's really wonderful.
Yes.
It's the strategy of training both parents and community members around Know Your Rights campaigns is definitely one that has borne fruit in so many other spaces. And I think my organization, First 5 LA, is both an advocacy organization as well as a public grant maker. And so we've done a host of trainings throughout the county for both county offices of ed, for school districts, and for community-based organizations as a train the trainer module. Some of them are candidly trainings that are like, as a parent, that you're not ever going to want to think about creating a separation plan if a parent is absconded by ICE. But a child needs to know where to go, and the levels of trauma that children are experiencing as a result of worrying about whether their parents will actually be there when they come back from school are real. And it's a small thing to actually have a family reunification plan, but it's something that trusted CBOs within a community are best situated to be able to sort of impart that information about how to reunify. And our national policies are very much bearing out this idea that it is difficult to reunify when parents are taken into detention facilities. It's also very empowering for school districts to know their rights, for preschools to know that they don't actually have to turn over their enrollment records and address records. And being able, actually the LA County Office of Education did a training for all of the school districts to basically train them and also do a little bit of role play to say, if ICE comes to your preschool door, here's your script. Here's how you say no, which is not necessarily something that people normally think about as part of their professional development as school district administrators, but it's been something I think that has given a lot of calm to families who otherwise have felt uncertain. Another thing that I'll just, as you were sort of asking about bright spots, I think in California, we've also in the last couple of years undergone a new funding formula for K-12 schools with the idea that there's a 20% bump in school funding for 3 target populations: low-income children, foster youth, and English language learners. When it was initially passed, and I think in different parts of the country it's either called a weighted student formula or it goes by a lot of different names and has been tried, I think, in New Jersey, as well as a couple of southern states. But initially the conversation was, will this really work? Are we just throwing money at a problem? Will we actually see gains? And now that we've had a couple of years to actually see what I think should have been pretty obvious. Yes, money does make a difference, in fact. It is not rocket science either, but it's now been measured and quantified. So for every additional $1,000 that an English language learner receives in school funding, there's a 6% increase in graduation rates. And those are not easy gains to come by for garden variety K-12 interventions. There's also an accompanying bump in academic performance in math and English language arts. And those are proof points for other states that are thinking about, does it actually pencil out to invest? It does. And there's 6.2 million school children in California as your sample size to actually use as a proof point.
I would just add that I think one of the things that we can do in schools now is to actually acknowledge that it's happening. I think, it's very interesting to me when there is a really kind of communal traumatic event, right? Everybody thinks of the school shooting, and immediately there's media coverage, there's understandably so, I'm not minimizing that, but there's an actual acknowledging that the system, that something is shocking that community, right? And there's counselors, and now we can argue whether that's sufficient or enough or crisis response or what have you, but I think what everyone can do, what we all can do, is actually hold that up and say, this is traumatic. This is traumatic. And I think we have a responsibility, certainly as community-based organizations, and I think as leaders in many regards, to actually hold that up and validate for students that this is traumatic, and validate for parents that their fear is in fact justified. I had a conversation with someone who shall remain nameless, who said, well, I just don't understand why parents would not be coming. It's probably because they just don't care about their kids' education and so on and so forth. This is a true story, and it happened about a week and a half ago. And I said, have you seen the news? Oh yeah, but that happened, this was in a large county, and it happened in a different part of a county. I'm like, you should really check out the Spanish news, because they've been playing this in loop for the last 3 days. And so yes, it may have happened 10 miles down the road, but for these families, it is here, it is present. And I think the fact that we as a community don't respond as a community to really what is a communal or community trauma, I think that is something that I think each of us can do and actually say, it is happening, it is scary, and what you feel is legitimate. It's not in your head, you're not overblowing it, and it's not okay. Now, taking the next step of saying what can be done, I agree with Kim, and know your rights, and all these are ways to respond to that. But I think some of us may or may not feel that's our role, and that's okay. But I do think everyone here has a role to play to validate and acknowledge that this is happening and this is real, and people feeling these feelings of fear and concern and retreat are legitimate.
Gloria, we also found that not only the children whose families were targeted,
Absolutely.
but the other children in the same school and in the same classrooms who were not targeted.
That's right.
Were feeling the same trauma.
That's right.
They come to school and their best friend is no longer there from one day to the next. What's happened to him? Nobody knows. Right. And it sends the whole classroom into turmoil, and the teacher is trying to grapple with what to do in this classroom where the children are so upset. So I just want to echo what you're saying. We need to acknowledge that this is traumatizing. And of course, here in California, with such a high percentage, we have the largest number and the highest percentage of immigrants in this state. It's pervasive.
It is.
I have a question this is from Aaron McLeod, who is with Intervene, and the platform that they have actually focuses on math and English interventions, and they spend about 45 to 50 minutes with students engaging with a live tutor in groups, and certainly serve Latino students. And so they try to adapt the lessons to demographics, to culturally relevant content, and they just wanted, he was asking if you had any suggestions of how that content, what they can include in it to engage and motivate Latino students. It's a big question.
Content around math and...
This is content from a live tutor who's doing, I think, on math and English interventions. And so if there's particular ways in which you think there's been effective curriculum and content to really motivate Latino students and engage them, I think that's the general question.
If I can, I think especially in math, although not exclusively in math, I think exposure to two things. One, in math specifically, is to see themselves in those roles as thinkers and as mathematicians and as innovators. I think that's what we do with families. We actually show them pictures of other people of color who have done and changed the world in incredible ways. So I would say having students see themselves in that capacity visually and sort of weaving in an idea or a concept from that, in math in particular. And I think in English language arts, I think highlighting oral histories is critically important. They may come from families where their parent may or may not be literate. They may come from a family or a context in which their families may speak any number of dialects, or, you know, so for me, this is really sort of acknowledging, basically, as we've been saying, and being respectful that their experience and their family experience is legitimate, and that in these sessions, seeing themselves reflected or their family acknowledged in some way, their culture acknowledged, is just as valuable, and that enables them then, I think, to find a way of connecting back to their older brother or to their cousin or to their parent would be important.
Yeah. I would add one other thing, and that's there's a lot written about the funds of knowledge and connecting with the parents. So maybe the parent has a middle school education, but that parent is a carpenter, is a plumber, is having to use math all the time in his or her work, and bringing those parents into the school to be models for the children. That connects them to both the academic piece and the home piece.
That's right.
I would add that if you weren't in the previous session, you should definitely talk to EL Success Forum, because that's exactly what they do. The other thing that I would say is that you really need to talk to the parents, right? And find out what are how is it that they engage with kids around math. And I think that one of the things that is very cultural is that as we're growing up, our parents, because we're translators, because we sort of do all these things, our parents ask us to do all kinds of higher order thinking all the time that you might not be aware of, right? And, you know, when I had to translate for my mother by the time I was in kindergarten. I had just started school, right? And I had to run errands for her, right? Because the person at the store only spoke English. So how do you tap into those stories that a lot of people in a lot of Latinos can relate to? It's by talking to the community directly and learn about how do parents engage in learning in a way that may not look like sort of the typical way for middle class communities, but is certainly sort of the way we learn. I remember one of the first words that I sounded out in my home was Pattillo. And they all know what that means because it's hot sauce. And that's what we had on the table all the time. And my mom would have me read labels all the time.
I thought it was because your family was from Guadalajara.
My mom is from Jalisco, but it's mostly because of the red bottle sitting on my table.
We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.